It's time for another Two Women Talking. I am Liana with Song. We are Tomboy and Girly Girl. And this episode, the next two episodes, they tend to be two-parters. We're talking bad boys versus bad guys. And I'm going to tell you guys right off the top, I'm going to experiment with mid-roll ads on this one, just because that, hey, maybe it's a way to break up the conversation, whatever. But we'll see. It'll be a bit of an experiment. It looks like a lot what YouTube recommends. So this will be some trial and error, just warning everybody off the top. So it isn't just what did they do. Another bit of housekeeping. Song asked me to let her address a comment from the last video. There's actually about something I said. When she mentioned it, was like, huh? Because I just, whatever, next. I'm so used to being yelled at. But Song, I'll let you address this comment because you do feel really strongly about it.
Yeah. So in the last one you talked about, and it was specifically when we were talking about guys not viewing these stories as permission to dream, basically. And you mentioned how a lot of guys, they seem to have this checklist in their head that it's like, you go to school, you go to college, you get a car, you get a job, you get a wife, basically. And how it's all this process without space for adventure or dreaming. And there was a comment that from, I believe it was a guy who was saying that, well, if men don't fulfill the checklist, then no woman will consider them, basically. And that irritated me a bit, because I think if you're so focused on the checklist, well, that's the kind of person you're going to attract.
Yep.
It's because if you make that your entire life, then what you're going to be around is people who are doing the same thing.
Yep.
And one thing we don't, we have this mentality in society that if you're not in a relationship, and especially if you're not having sex, there's something wrong with you. And you're not being a full person or whatever. But one thing we don't talk about is it's like, if you actually want to be in a committed relationship, if you want to build a partnership with someone, you need to have your shit together. You cannot be waiting on someone. I ended up getting more passionate about this than I expected.
I like it. Keep going.
But you cannot be expecting someone to come in and make you feel complete or fix your life. In Rocky, we actually haven't brought up Rocky in a while.
Let's bring up Rocky.
Yes. In Rocky, part of what I love about that story is, when Paulie asks Rocky, what do you see in my sister? He says, we fill gaps. Yeah. And yes, there's that, but you cannot expect someone to complete your life. Instead of being focused on just filling out a checklist, go live your life. Yeah. And you have to know yourself. You have to know what you like. And you have to go out and have your adventures and find out what you love. And when you're out there doing that, you'll meet people who love the same things. Yep. And who are doing the same things. And that way you'll find someone who's compatible with you. And if you know what you want and you know where you want to go in life, you can find someone who has compatible goals, and you can work together to help each other achieve your goals. It's not the main quest. It's DLC.
Yeah.
That makes the story better.
Yeah.
It's so important to stop wasting time trying to find someone when you're just desperate to have someone complete you. Go complete yourself so you actually have something to offer. And that's how you find someone else who's also a complete person, is by being a complete person yourself. And that's when you can have a happy, fulfilling, healthy relationship. Not when you're so focused on just trying to meet a checklist because society tells you you're incomplete without it.
Yeah, I mean, the irony of a guy lecturing women on what women want is kind of funny. And I know I'm not a typical woman, so I'm okay with people checking me on it, but the fact that we're in agreement here, and I've actually got a dating coach for men coming on It's Not Therapy next episode, and she says a lot of the same things you did, Song. So it just, you're right, you attract what you see, right?
Yeah.
And I mean, I could cite statistics. It's amazing that people claim they like data and then totally ignore the data. But I mean, on the whole, non-college educated people tend to have more children than college educated people do. So the
Yes.
thing about the money and all that stuff clearly isn't so, right? But
Yeah.
also Gen Z is having less sex than, well, the boomers had more sex than any of us. Which is not surprising. It was the whole free love thing. You know,
Yeah.
AIDS really changed the way people interacted. And, you know, if you look at the data, that's just not where Gen Z's at. And I think that's great. I think you're absolutely right. You don't you end up, and this is more talking to women than men. But I'm sure it's true for a lot of men too. You end up feeling taken advantage of or cheap even when you're not, if you're not coming at it from a place of an enthusiastic yes.
Hmm.
If you're just doing it because you think it's something you're supposed to do or it's required of you or you don't want to hurt somebody's feelings, that you're gonna feel victimized even if nobody's doing anything wrong.
And this is actually one of my biggest concerns for girls nowadays is I feel like girls especially are being told you can have sex with whoever you want. I don't know if there's enough messaging of, but you also don't
Cannot.
have to.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I feel like there is this sexualization, and I don't even think it's just the media. It's just this, oh, you can do whatever you want. But I I worry that a lot of girls aren't really told it's okay to not. It's
I
okay to
I
want to wait.
I think both binary genders are being told that, right?
Yeah.
It's a really toxic message, which brings us to bad boys versus bad guys. And I'll give
And
you
oh
guys,
boy, do I have a lot to say.
yeah, this was sort of inspired by our private discussions about the show House of the Dragon,
Well,
because it, well, Song told me to watch it
well,
because of this.
I, you, you suggested the topic, and
Yeah.
I was like, well, look, if we're going to talk about bad boys, I feel like you need to see the current big one, which is Daemon Targaryen.
And I'm like, what? No, dude makes sense. And this
Okay,
is why
well,
we make such a good pairing. Because I'm like, what?
well, it's like, he fits the bad boy love interest stereotype in a bit of a way, and I'll get more into that. But
Kind of.
admittedly,
Let's define it for people, because people love, a lot of people with autism watch this channel. We need to
yes.
define our terms, because that's one of the things I found, because I realized that when we were talking, we were defining it in two different ways. I was going straight up the 50s bad boy, sort of the James Dean archetype.
Rebel without a cause, yeah.
Rebel without a cause, social transgression, just because the boxes everybody was in were so intense. And the bad boy trope slash cliche was a temporary freedom for the female character through this tragic social transgressor. And there were some characters in the 30s and 40s that were cautionary tales in this
Yeah.
way with men, the same way the femme fatale was. Then the 50s started going, okay, we're gonna say something with these characters, and then we get James Dean all the way through. Apparently the white t-shirt was code for a bad boy, because at the time that was considered underwear. It was an undershirt.
Yes.
So there
And
was,
the
there was sort
the
of a danger there.
the image of like the classic, they're the early punks in a
Yes,
way.
the greasers.
It Yeah, the greasers, thank you.
Yeah,
It was those jeans, which jeans traditionally were clothes worn by
yeah.
blue collar
Workers.
workers
Yeah,
and miners and
yeah,
railroad workers.
yeah.
And so when teenagers started wearing them, specifically like middle class and upper class teenagers,
Mhm.
this was a big deal because it's specifically you're wearing the clothing of the proletariat,
Right. Right.
basically.
And
And
yeah.
it was a statement.
Yeah.
And then you combine it with the white shirt. This is just a random note, but I remember reading a manga from, I think it was from the 90s, called
Mm-hmm.
Kare no to Kanojo no Jijo.
Mm-hmm.
It means his and her circumstances. But
Okay.
there was a flashback arc to one of the characters' fathers, who was one of those Japanese greaser punks
Right.
in the 80s. And one of the things the mangaka talked about was she was doing a lot of research into it, and she's like, for being punks, they were like very deliberate, and like they would style their hair
Yep.
carefully, and they wore the right white t-shirts, but they always rolled up the sleeves
Yep.
up to their shoulders, and like it
Yep.
was very precisely done. And I
And then
think
you
they
kept
do
your
that.
cigarettes in the sleeve.
Yes. And
Yeah.
I think Yu Yu Hakusho showed the rolled up sleeves as well. But it's like, you look back then, I've talked before how it's like, I don't like modern fashion because it can get so sloppy, especially in
Yeah.
this decade. But it's like, even in the 50s, it's like, and up through the 80s, kind of, the punks, they still had a level of class to them. Then it turned
Yeah.
into mohawks and black leather
Well, then the
jackets.
60s happened, right? And we got a
Yeah.
deconstructing of culture, or an entropy of culture. And so all the tropes went weird, and that's when, to me, bad boys just started becoming bad guys, with a dip in the 80s. I'll stick a pin in that, because
Yeah.
I not during the summer after Olivia Newton-John passed away, they ran Grease at the drive-in.
Oh, yeah.
And I'm like, I gotta go see Grease at the drive-in, because I mean, the worst song in the whole movie takes place at a drive-in, but you still got to do it, right? And
I've still never seen Grease.
Danny Zuko, I was amazed at what an asshole he is.
Yeah.
I have never been the biggest Grease fan. I never got it. Big surprise, right?
Yeah.
I liked the John Waters movie starring Johnny Depp with a very young Ricky Lake and Tracy Lords, called Crybaby, which was sort of a spoof of that whole thing. But Crybaby was an awesome movie. But Crybaby was sort of what happened when you mix Grease and Heathers together. And I don't want to skip over Heathers, because the Christian Slater character in Heathers is very, very important for this discussion. But
Yes, we brought that up
yeah,
before.
Danny Zuko is just an asshole. There is nothing, I don't get it. He's one of those guys who's super sweet to you, but when his buddies aren't around, and then he's a flaming dickbag when the guys are watching. And that's not the James Dean bad boy.
No.
The bad boy is sort of, he tries to push people away, but once you're in, you're in. Right?
Yes.
And I mean, Grease was a weird movie. I'm not going to derail and go on a tangent that way. But that's a shining example of, everybody looks at that and sees like Danny Zuko is sort of the prototypical bad boy. And there's that whole thing where he's in the leather, the letter jacket, not the leather jacket, the letter
Yeah.
jacket at the end of Grease. And she's wearing the
The black
tight
spandex.
black pants that were this like sexual awakening for suburban boys everywhere, right? And it's supposed to be this sort of coming together, but there's been a lot of ink spilled, well, digital ink spilled, about how Sandy has to come way more over the line for him than he does for her. And I don't know how I sit with that. I like every other character in Grease more than those two.
Okay, so this actually ties. So I made notes
Yep.
because I'm passionate on this subject. And so that's actually something that I was really thinking about, because one of my favorite YouTubers is a channel that he does breakdowns of really bad books.
Okay.
And I'm talking about like, he's done a lot of self-published, but recently he's been doing like 50 Shades.
Oh,
and
yes. This is when the trope just gets trashed, right?
Well, he did 365 Days, but the one he's doing right now is After by Anna Todd.
I've just heard about the big shit around this series.
Yeah, it started out as Harry Styles fan fiction.
Okay.
Yeah, and it was on Wattpad. So like
Oh,
I remember walking into the library one day and seeing all 5 of them on the new bookshelf,
right.
and picking them up, and they're these big books. And so I'm just reading the the blurb on the back,
Mm-hmm.
and it was exhausting going through
The
all 5.
blurb.
Like, yes.
Oh my
So
God.
it's all like, oh, they meet and she's cheating on her boyfriend because her
Oh,
boyfriend's boring, and here's this bad boy that comes in, and like even Harry Styles fans have been like, does she hate Harry Styles? Is that why she wrote this? um but then it's like there's stuff about relapse and cheating and breaking up and getting back together, and I'm like, look, I stopped reading Ultimate Spider-Man at one point because I got sick
yeah.
of Peter and MJ breaking up. I just
Yep.
wanted them to be together.
Yep.
um
Yep.
so,
Yep. Yep.
and I'm like, I'm definitely not putting in these books where that's the whole point. But one thing, so listening to his video, and he hasn't even finished the after book. It's just he released the
It's
first
that
part last
bad.
week.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, the first video is like 2.5 hours.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
So there's gonna be more, and I love it because he does these really in-depth breakdowns both on like the writing and characterization and everything.
Right.
But one, okay, so I will come back to that and like the appeal of the bad boy, because we haven't
See,
quite
that
gotten to that
that
point.
to
But
me isn't a bad boy. That's a bad guy.
and I think that is the difference. And too
Yeah.
often, so a lot of these characters, especially as we see them in nowadays when they're badly written
Mm-hmm.
in or immature, it's the writers think they're depicting this like brooding alpha male with a tragic
Yes.
backstory, but more often than not, they're just writing these toxic little snots who use their trauma as an excuse to be toxic and
Preach.
abusive.
Yeah.
And it perpetuates this idea, this whole I can fix him idea for girls,
Mm-hmm.
which
Mm-hmm.
is so dangerous. And the idea that his anger issues, addictions, or self-destructive behaviors can be solved if she just loves him the right way
Yep.
for some stuff. But more often than not, that involves him trampling and steamrolling all over her boundaries and her
Yep.
principles and who she is. And it comes back to that point about Danny and Sandy,
Mm-hmm.
where it's like
Yeah.
she does all that. She starts smoking. At least we see her with the cigarette in the
Yeah.
end. And it's he'll push her sexually. He'll
Yeah.
push this or that, and it's all. But I will physically assault you or sexually assault you, but it's crouched in this I need you. And so
Yeah.
it turns it into she's important to him.
Yeah. But he
And
joined the
it
track
makes
team, so it's all okay.
uh,
Yeah.
and so it makes it that, oh, she's important. She's the special one. And it's like,
Yeah.
I love the idea of, obviously we've talked about my love for the barbarian prince. So the
Yeah.
idea where it's like, I will kill anyone but her. And
Right.
she is the one person who will see me be really kind and sweet. But at the same time, if it's just her, I commented on one of your videos saying, and I can't remember if I brought this up before, but the idea that one of the best pieces of dating advice I think I ever heard was, if you want to know what a guy is really like, see how he treats his mother and
Yeah.
sisters.
Yeah.
And I got pounced on for that.
Yeah, that was
And
weird because that's
people
just
were,
sort of
yeah, yeah, it was all these whataboutisms of,
what if
well,
I hate my mother? Well, that's a red flag. Because even if you hate your
yeah,
mother, you don't do that in front of somebody you don't know that well. See, that's a
yeah.
fucking Daemon Targaryen rule. I can talk shit about my brother, you can't.
Well, they also brought up, well, what if the mother and sisters are abusive? And I'm like, you're missing the point.
Yeah, yeah. You're using edge cases to not listen because
Yeah.
wow, we're learning a lot about you right now. All
Yeah.
right, buddy.
And it's also like the advice of, if you go on a date with someone, how does he treat the waiter?
Yeah.
And how does he treat the people around him he's not trying to impress? And
That's
that's
right.
the whole point of the advice.
Yeah.
Is look
Yeah.
at how they treat others less than how they treat you. And
Yeah.
that's really important.
And the the classic 50s bad boy was, he didn't treat other people badly. He treated himself terribly and was self-destructive, and it tended to be like property crimes and stuff like that. But he when it mattered, he tended to show respect for things like Black people. There were these little things where, because white people and Black people, they didn't intermix, and so it was the whole Elvis thing of the crossover. And there was all this sort of subversive social coding back in the day, and nowadays I'm very concerned with the intertwining with narcissism that we get with Edward Cullen, Christian Grey. The fact that Bella must always bleed to prove loyalty to Edward is like, yikes, that is not the classic bad boy trope.
And we've seen how things have evolved, because we've gone from Twilight, which was fairly chaste, and I think
it was really disturbing how, what's his name at the end of the beats the shit out of her against that mirror. I'm talking the books. I don't know. I didn't see the movies. I was like, there's no fucking
first
way.
one, I think.
Yeah, like Bella
when she's attacked by the other guy.
Yeah, like what is that? That weird loyalty proof that the bad boy for the female lead is supposed to be about freedom, not about suffering. I don't know when you nailed it, that it shifted from the idea of freedom to the idea of specialness.
Yeah.
And this whole Little Love He'll Change has had, I have to prove my loyalty to him against the world has been grafted on. And I'm like, what the shit is happening? I'm horrified.
Yeah, and ironically, you mentioned that, and I remember part of one of my frustrations as I was watching Doctor Who is I felt like the companions became too special.
See, I started having issues with the Matt Smith run with River. He was kind of where it abusive to her. Yeah, I mean, she was a great character. And
she's fantastic.
Yeah, what's her name? The actress,
Alex
Kingston?
Yes.
Yeah, yeah. She was phenomenal. But the fact that he breaks her wrist in the second Stone Angels episode, like, what?
No, she breaks her own
right
wrist
to get away. That's right. She's forced to do it. But I'm like, that's just, I mean, the shit with the Tenant Doctor and Time
Lord Victorious.
And the whole thing with Karen Gillian's character, Amy Pond. That was a little weird. And then the whole thing with Rory having to go through time, shit went weird, and it was strange to me. And that was Moffat and his fucking damage, and you see it all through his Sherlock too. And there are just certain patterns. If a creator does it once, it's one thing. If a creator keeps doing this, they are saying something about what they think is normal. And the bad boy is never supposed to be the norm.
No.
He's supposed to be a transgression from the norm.
Yeah. And, a lot of things, and someone else pointed this out. It was another video I was watching from another favorite YouTuber, actually, but one thing she pointed out is, a lot of people use because there's this idea of, women don't want nice guys, they want jerks. And people try to use the whole bad boy trope as proof of that. It's like, they want someone to treat them. No. The thing is, the classic bad boy
doesn't mistreat the woman.
Yeah, and even up until recently, it wasn't that he was a jerk. It was that he was emotional.
And he keeps people at arm's length.
Yes, but it's in a way that proves he's thoughtful, and especially for young readers who might still be in high school or college, and they're surrounded by all these teen boys who it's the dude bros.
That's right.
The jock stereotypes who don't have a thought in their head because they're just kind of whatever. The idea of the brooding bad boy who plays piano or reads classic literature or does this or that is really appealing.
Yeah.
someone who you can actually think and have a conversation with.
Yeah.
I can definitely see the appeal in that.
Yeah.
And there is also that he's broken and I want to help him. And unfortunately, it does come back to that. I can fix him. I'm the one person who can do that. No. It's just so
Yeah,
it's like,
I mean,
the bad boy is not supposed to be a jerk.
yeah.
Now, unfortunately, that has become so prevalent, and it comes back to something we talked about before. In romance novels, all these writers who they're trying to write the strong alpha male, and it's just become this joke of the alpha hole because he fucking sucks.
Yeah.
And he's such a jerk. And I'm like, women write this?
Yeah. Well, immature people. And
absolutely.
And unfortunately, I do think I'm trying not to be too judgy with what I'm about to say. And because I have read YA stuff.
Yeah.
But when I'm reading YA, I'm like, this is not for me. Don't overthink it too much. This is not landing on a 15-year-old the way it's landing on me. And then I start going, okay, but to a point, that's the problem, because the one I've talked about this before, the one I've been utterly horrified by lately is Sandman.
Yeah.
And how adults are not seeing the red flags on Dream. And I didn't see the red flags on Dream when I was 17. And I struggled for a while until a YouTube commenter finally made it click for me. It wasn't that, me thinking Dream was dreamy at the time primed me for abuse. It's that abuse was already normal for me. And so I didn't see the problem. He was better than my circumstances. Therefore, he was a good guy.
Oh.
And now to see, it's much different when he's mistreating his white male servant. Lucien's a servant, right? When he's mistreating his white male servant, it shouldn't read differently, but it does, because we're so used to Batman being a dick to Alfred in DC Comics, right? It was just sort of a trope. This is the way they do things. But to see the exact same relationship with, I admit, I found a gender and race swap Lucien very attractive. And so to see him be a dick to so many Black and mixed race women on that show, it just made what a horrible bully and abuser of power Dream is. Now, part of it, they raced some of the storytelling, and it just looks so bad when it wasn't, when there wasn't the lead up to it. It was just this concentrated awful, but still, he does do all the things he does in the show in the books, right? And I'm like, this was freaking everywhere in the 90s. And but I mean, goth was so, and that's when they get into the LGBTQ plus inclusion in Sandman and what's been lost, because there certainly was that inclusion in that series, and the self-destructiveness of we called them gay people back then. We don't do that anymore, right? Because it's too stigmatizing, right? But to realize you are different, and that nihilism and the self-destruction, that is not the paradigm now, and everything looks different. And I mean, the 90s bad boy, I talked about Johnny Depp and Crybaby. And then the inversion of the bad boy in Edward Scissorhands. Pretty much every Johnny Depp character in the 90s was a bad boy somehow, because he Corporal Clingered himself off of 21 Jump Street. That was the first time he trashed his career. And so that they were why are you laughing?
Just Corporal Klinger.
Oh yeah, he did all this weird shit because
it's like, I'm just picturing that time when Klinger, he puts on like a fuzzy pink robe and bunny slippers and tries to hang glide.
No, apparently Johnny Depp was like smearing peanut butter on his face and stuff, like, because he didn't want to quit, because he knew if you quit, that's it, you're done. But if you get fired, that's different. So he was doing all this weird shit to get fired from 21 Jump Street, and of course then the only roles he could get was this brooding bad boy, and he was really good at being a brooding bad boy. And now he's like this weird eccentric drunk uncle dude. It's hard sometimes to remember that no, he was him and Christian Slater was sort of the quintessential bad boy of the 80s. And Johnny Depp was the quintessential bad boy of the 90s. Now the Christian Slater bad boy was terrifying deliberately, right? And I mean, his character in Heathers was yikers, almost going back more to the 30s and 40s. Actually, it was exactly what it was, that he is bad for you. He may seem exciting, but he's bad for you. Don't go off the path, little girl. It's the old fairy tale structure, right?
Yeah. I actually saw Heathers the musical, a bootleg, admittedly, before I saw
that is so freaky to me. And you're
movie.
not the only person who said that, but like Heathers was one of those movies when I was a teen, right? That it was one of those movies adults didn't want you to see.
Yeah. And I think the musical became big enough that it caused a bit of a resurgence.
Yeah, it did.
So personally, I prefer the musical because I think it handles the story a bit better.
How so?
The movie tends to do these jump cuts and doesn't quite explain things.
Oh yeah, it was the MTV generation.
Yeah. And the musical, I felt, delves a lot, and obviously it's a musical, it can do this. It delves a lot more into like, especially what Veronica is thinking. And they also build up the relationship between her and JD more. And so it does actually feel like he loves her. And it comes back to this, he's so broken because, you know, he lost his mother. And so when she's assaulted by the jocks, you see him, he's actually crying. That, like, they hurt you. I'm going to hurt them. And this whole, our love is God. And this is what matters.
That was such a controversial thing in the 80s. Let me tell you, that stuff. Oh, you still couldn't do that back then.
Yeah.
Like, and that movie was such a revelation. Because it was dealing with, I mean, there's another era. James Spader was a heartthrob back then. You know, it was, these guys do grow up. And it's interesting because Christian Slater is playing a very similar type of character in Mr. Robot, only as a dad instead of the love interest. And it's like, fuck, mind blown. Like sign of the times, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, it's interesting to hear your perspective as somebody who sort of came to it retroactively through an adaptation.
Yeah.
Because it's true that there are certain things about the 80s because they couldn't go all in on certain things. Apparently, Winona Ryder's agent begged her not to take that movie because it was going to be so controversial that they were afraid she'd ruin her career. But she believed so strongly in the material that she did it. And obviously, you know, it was the right choice. But yeah, there were certain things they had to ish. Yeah. Because that whole topic was so controversial.
Have you seen the musical?
I've seen bits of it.
Okay.
I glance off of it. The music's not my favorite thing, but I'm trying. Someone I love dearly is a big fan of it. He's chuckling if he's listening right now. So I am trying to de-asshole I'm trying to unclench my sphincter on it and accept it for what it is.
Well, one thing I think they do really well is instead of just jumping into where Veronica is already friends with the Heathers, instead we see how that happened. Another thing they did was Martha Dunstock, who's just this random girl who steps in front of a truck.
Right.
In the movie, they actually make her Veronica's best friend. So like it brings her more into the story and humanizes her a
See,
bit.
this is such an intergenerational thing because back in the 80s, we all knew we just, okay, this is how they became friends in my mind. This is who this girl was in my mind. We filled in those blanks in a way that people don't anymore. And it's fascinating to me.
I mean,
we didn't need this stuff back then. It's so interesting.
see, now I feel a bit bad that I couldn't fill it in myself.
No, it's not bad or good. It's just amazing how much storytelling has changed and how much the expectations have changed. That you filled in because I mean, it was like I said, it was the MTV generation. We were consuming stories in 3 minutes and 5 seconds.
Yeah, now that I think about it, it does have a very music video feel.
Totally.
And that's
totally
what that choppiness is.
Yeah, it was So I Want My MTV that defined the 80s in a way that was very, very real. And you have to sort of look at everything. Movies like Ghostbusters that didn't do that were very much an anomaly.
I'm going to have that guitar riff stuck in my head for like the rest of the day.
Yeah, because it's so MTV. Yeah.
Oh yeah.
Like we cannot describe. Well, it is sort of like the way we're seeing social media and sort of meta commentary creep into shows now in a way that's very
I hate it.
In a way, I kind of agree with you. In a way, it's a good way of not having that scene of somebody calls somebody and goes all the way over to have a 5-minute conversation because people just don't do that anymore.
Yeah. I don't mind social media. It's the meta commentary I cannot stand.
I think it's interesting. It feels more like theater to me.
Well, we may be having different interpretations of meta commentary, but it's like, so like we were talking about earlier, I watched Disenchanted last night.
Yeah.
And I told you I give Enchanted and Disenchanted a lot of leeway because they're supposed to be parodies.
Mm-hmm.
But when the other deconstructions, but when something like Frozen or Moana tries to deconstruct in the story, I'm like, no, you are now insulting me because I am the main fan of your stories.
Oh yeah, that's not what I mean by meta commentary. Okay. I mean like the greater world trying to it's that fine line between relevant, which I can't stand, and how do you do fellow kids, right? Mm-hmm. The way they do the texting in Ms. Marvel, for instance, or the whole we're going to predict the trolls on She-Hulk. That's what I'm talking about. The way they seem or the fake Easter eggs in WandaVision, the way they are so hyper aware that social media is going to consume this stuff. And so, they end on a cliffhanger so that people will speculate for an entire week about, instead of it being just the mid-season and season ender cliffhanger to get you to watch next season, it's every fucking week. So they get the water cooler and the social media trend. And that to me is the MTV inspiration of now. Mm-hmm. And also I think some of the popular call outs of, oh, it's a show for teen girls. We must dunk on Taylor Swift at some point. Because that's relevant. That's what girls understand, right? I mean, Harry Styles being the ultimate is another one I admit I don't get. He wasn't my favorite. What band was he in?
One Direction.
Yeah, he wasn't my favorite One Direction guy. I think the guy's pretty good at what he does. But
he's doing something interesting.
Yeah.
And I give him credit for that. And some people are like, well, he's just imitating Bowie and Peter Gabriel. So he's not doing anything groundbreaking.
He's throwing in a side of Kurt Cobain too. And let's face it, he's doing it as a pre-established teen heartthrob, which is innovative.
Well, what's interesting is it's like Bowie did this stuff in the 80s, and now people are giving Harry Styles a hard time for not being innovative enough and for just copying. But it's like, but the fact this is still controversial.
Yeah, more so some ways. When I point out that, what was it? Bowie is Ziggy Stardust referred to himself as a mama papa. That's gender defying, folks, and you know the gender criticals argue with me about that. He calls himself he. It's like we didn't have the idea of pronoun swaps back then, but he was definitely going there by saying he was bisexual. He was a power bottom. You know, he definitely, it was definitely androgynous gender bending. Like, come on, guys, Boy George, Twisted Sister, we did this all
Annie
in the
Lennox,
yeah,
even.
yeah. Like, will you please calm yourselves? This is not that big a deal. And I mean, we did it more in the 80s, and this is the other thing that people forget. We are in a completely different cultural climate now than we were in the 80s, because in the 80s it was all, well, nuclear bombs, we're all going to die, performative apathy.
Yeah.
Right? It's the exact opposite of being forced to care very much like we do now. And I do think that the bad boy in the 80s and that horribly self-destructive thing we had going on was none of this matters, so let's have a moment of freedom, of sublime, of something that feels deep and real. And instead of breaking us out of needing to care so very, very much, or breaking us out of needing to follow all these rules, it was giving ourselves permission to actually give a shit. The bad boy did a different thing in the 80s. And one of the things that I think is sort of ruined the bad boy now and blurred the line between bad boy and bad guy is the BBC Sherlock problem that the Disney Plus Loki show also stepped in, was giving the bad boy a diagnosis and getting stuck in that. You know, Sherlock announces in the first episode, I'm not, or bipolar or something like that. I'm a
high functioning
sociopath. Get it right. I'm like, okay, you have no empathy. First of all, you're not Sherlock Holmes. You can't love, sir. I don't care what happens to you. And it destroys that bad boy deep feelings, make him understandable, or I don't want to say likable, because bad boys aren't traditionally likable, but that deep,
the appeal,
that deep,
I think,
feeling, the capacity for deep feeling and deep connection with that one special person,
the pathos, I think, is the right word.
is so essential to that trope not being a bad person, just being a bad boy. You know, you also need that edge of, you know, James Dean was only 24 when he died. I read one commentary that said it is very important to remember that bad boys are boys. They are not men. They're usually portrayed as on the cusp of manhood, but they are not yet men, and they're chafing against adult male responsibilities.
And that's something else I was going to bring up.
When your bad boy is 900 years old, Edward Cullen and Loki, I'm sorry, it doesn't work anymore. You're just an immature asshole at that point. And the fact I was so upset that Tom Hiddleston got saddled with that narcissist character point, because I completely disagree. And okay, we can say the show is wrong, but the show clearly does not believe it's wrong. So what were you going to say about the bad boy being a boy?
So they are extremely immature, and we see it even more now. And also just like, you know, and you mentioned the whole diagnosis, and it, you know, I've talked about, I know I've talked to you about it. I don't know if I've brought it up on the podcast, but it's just because you have a diagnosis, just because you have trauma, just because your behavior is rooted in trauma, does not mean you have the right to treat anyone badly. And you can't just go, well, this is who I am. No, you have to continue to work to improve yourself. And that's, I think that's a problem I have with a lot of this. Oh, you're perfect just the way you are. You know, everyone, you know, you're great. It's like, but we still have to improve. we can't get so caught up in telling people they're fine just the way they are. Like, I get why the messaging is important, but it's a bit of a catch-22 because you
It's
can't.
I don't think it's the right message. I agree with you.
Yeah,
I
it's
think it's that you are enough is
yes,
better than you're perfect.
yes.
Yeah.
So, and it's yeah, it's just so often the bad boy. It's like, oh well, I am this way because of all my trauma. Okay, grow up.
See,
We all have.
I always saw the classic bad boy back in the day is that they were always, somewhere between 16 and draft age, right? So 16 and
Yeah.
18, maybe a little older. As we stretched into new Hollywood cinema and college education became more the norm for media characters, it stretched on to like 21, 22, right?
Okay,
They are
I just need to say this. I feel like college education and that 4 to 6 years or so, it's just a delayed
Oh,
adolescence.
it is. It is. They've actually
And
documented that.
yeah, and I think it is absolutely terrible
Yeah,
for
but
society as a whole.
the fact that it moved up, it's the bad boy is right on the cusp of manhood,
Mm-hmm.
right? And traditionally it's that last period where he was allowed to have sincere feelings before adult man responsibilities crushes his heart,
Mm-hmm.
right? And he's raging against the dying of the light to get poetic,
Yeah.
and that is the archetype trapped in amber. And I do think that some of these characters have had the portrayals in modern age, because people just don't mature. They get
Mm-hmm.
stuck in college and they get so profoundly traumatized that they don't figure their shit out. That's why Daemon Targaryen is so fascinating to me, because his feelings get crushed and then they come back.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm like, oh, that's a different take on the so-called bad boy. I mean, I have other reasons why I think Daemon doesn't quite fit due to the world building of House of the
Yeah.
Dragon, but it is very, very important that writers, when they're using the bad boy trope, recognize that these are, and this is why I got so upset with um Superman, son of Kal-El, and calling a 17-year-old boy Superman. He's not.
Mm-hmm.
He's 17. Can we please protect our boys and allow them to develop? Don't rush their development. Don't force masculinity, adult masculinity on them before their brains are there.
Yeah.
Because that's what the trope is. The trope is basically that inner spirit of a creative, sensitive young man going, please don't kill me. I'd rather blow myself up. It's the Kurt Cobain. It's better to burn out than fade away. And I think that was saying something really important about not just the desires of women, because let's face it, these characters back in the day were written predominantly by men, right?
Mm-hmm.
They weren't written by women, even if the woman was the main character. It's like Dracula's not the main character of Dracula, right?
Yeah.
Frankenstein is the doctor, not the monster. But
Yep.
yeah, I do think that it was almost like a reaction against Hemingway in a lot of ways. And can we please be allowed the long hair, right? Because that was the whole thing. Oh, that hair was considered long by the standards of the holdover military aesthetic of the 50s, right? The greaser hair.
Yeah.
It was too
Yeah.
long. Get a haircut and get a real job, right? And I do think that I think that's why it appealed to, it was that women want them and men want to be them
Yeah.
feel. Um and I find that so fascinating, as somebody who does fight very much against gender conformity, because not that there's anything wrong with people who do, it's just I'm not. And can we all please have choices? I really identified with that. And I'm embarrassed to admit how many times I watched Crybaby, because it's not the greatest movie. It's a camp fest, but something about it really spoke to me more than Grease.
See, I find it interesting that you've been bringing up Crybaby recently. One of my one of the pattern designers I follow who does
Mhm.
vintage indie patterns, she just released the Wanda skirt,
Nice.
which is based on Crybaby.
Yeah,
It's
Tracy
like,
Lord's character, right?
yeah, so
Yeah.
complete with like the zipper for to create a slit
Yeah.
in it.
Well, I mean,
Um,
that was so subversive because Tracy Lord was, of course, was an adult actress. And oh my God, crossover, right? That wasn't done. Ooh, taboo. Uh,
yeah, so,
John Waters and David Cronenberg were some of the only people who would do that. So the coding of that film and the fact
mhm.
that they had Ricky Lake, who wasn't super skinny in the 90s. I don't remember exactly when Crybaby came out. Like there were all these the bad boy in art doesn't tend to exist on his own. There are other subversive elements of the work that are railing against social norms.
Mhm.
And if you don't have that structure, your bad boy is not a bad boy. He's just a bad guy. He's a bad person, and you're trying to cover it up with the fact that he feels bad about it. And you know how I feel about it. I don't give a shit about how bad you feel about doing bad things if you continue to do the bad things.
Yeah,
You said last time, I miss etiquette.
yeah.
I miss honor.
And for me, honor and etiquette are kind of tied
Yeah, they are.
together.
Yeah, etiquette is an
And
expression of honor.
yeah, and
Yeah.
people talk about chivalry and they get so caught up in just, oh, it's about how a man is supposed to treat a woman. No, it was
No. Yeah.
how a knight was supposed to behave.
It was
It
how you
covered
treat
everything.
Yeah. It was how
Yeah,
you treat people who can't fight back.
yeah, it's
Yeah.
everything from how to behave in a tournament
Yeah.
to
Don't murder monks when you pass them on the road. Like that was literally a rule.
yeah, it's like, don't murder peasants
Yeah.
and don't
Why do
spit on the
we
floor.
Yeah, why do we need that rule? Like that clearly happened. That is way too specific for some asshole to not have done that. Right?
Well, I mean, we see darker fantasy like The Witcher, and even um, Martin doesn't really do it, but a little. But these knights who it's like it, they were in positions of power, and
Yeah.
there are always going to be people in positions of power who don't deserve that power and so abuse it, and
I,
that's why we have to have the code of chivalry
yeah.
and rules of honor and etiquette because we kind of suck without them.
I did sort of like in the Witcher books, and I don't know if this is deliberate or something the games really punched up, because of course I'm reading it all in translation.
Mhm.
And the fan translations I think are much better than the official ones they released after I read them. I thumbed through them. It's like, ooh, I don't know. But I did find the way women used Geralt very interesting, and the way they treated him like basically a sex toy that couldn't get them pregnant, couldn't give them diseases, and wouldn't care.
Yeah.
And I of all the coarseness of those stories, the myth of the Witchers, the mythos, I mean, very different type of bad boy, right?
Yes.
um
And
and
I have a hard time even thinking of Geralt as a bad boy because when you really get down to it, he is a dork.
kind
And
of
in
kind
in
of well, are we
in this
talking
weird
book
way,
Witcher or game Witcher?
book.
Yeah, because he's way less of a dork in the games.
Yeah. Well, the games really made him badass. Like in the
They
books, it's
bring
like
him they bring the dork back in Witcher 3 more. The Witcher 3 I think is the one that's the most true to the books.
accurate.
Yeah.
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 And but it made me love him. Like
Yeah.
I'm just like, oh, sweetie.
He just gets so fucked by everything.
You
But
know, there's this story of, he wanted to be the noble knight. He wanted to
yeah.
be the hero.
Yeah.
And, he left Kaer Morhen.
Yeah.
And he's like, I'm going to save people.
Yeah.
And I'm going to do good. And the first time he rescued like a farmer and his daughter or something on
Yeah.
the road from bandits, and they hated him.
Yeah.
And they assumed he was going to
Yeah.
ravish the girl.
Yeah.
And it broke him.
Yeah, which is
And
is so Polish, World War II, Nazis, Russia. So like there's the social commentary right there, right? Like that's what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
And
so and you can see like he had through the books, you get to see a lot of trauma that he deals with. Like when he gets to meet his mother.
Yeah. Yeah.
I admit I kind of expected more from that scene because I knew it was coming. And as someone who has a parent that I've never met, I was kind of hoping for catharsis from it. And
the whole point I think is that it doesn't come. Knowing doesn't make it any better.
Yeah. And I think I see your point with that, and that makes a lot of sense. So
yeah,
all these
because I got that and I'm like, yes, because there I went Thor. Anything that makes me turn into Thor is probably very, very good. Yes, we work together. You know, like, yeah, it's funny because that The Witcher is an example of a bad boy railing against a bad world that works because it is based in something so very real and is just from the pain and the trauma of what the Polish people have gone through throughout history, stuck between the Germans and the Austrians and the Russian stuff. And
the small player surrounded by big powers.
Right. And the fact that he wanted to be a hero, but all he could manage to be was a monster hunter who is seen as a monster himself.
Yeah. And that's one thing Sapkowski did so well, was conveying how these little traumas affect the story and affect Geralt overall. And you see him carrying it all.
Yeah.
And points when he just stops.
Yeah.
And he pouts and has a bit of a tantrum.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Dandelion and the others have to be like, Geralt, get it together.
Yeah, and when Dandelion's telling you to get it together, like, fuck, man, like this dude's name is literally Buttercup, and we ignore that. Like, and when he goes full on suck it up, Buttercup, you know Geralt's at a low point, right? Yeah, it is really. I mean, there are bumps in the writing in those books. They do kind of roll around in the coarseness. But
there's one scene where Geralt is at an inn and he can see the innkeeper groping and molesting like the 14-year-old girl who works there.
Yeah.
And that was the moment I'm like, okay, I can't love you quite as much, Geralt, but I get it.
Well, then you look
at why he got to that point where he just turns away.
I actually went and I looked at the teen rape statistics in Poland, and that's a truth in that culture.
Yeah.
They have a serious problem. And I did the internal damage. Oh my God, my brain just went 4 different places on this. And that's why I think The Witcher, as flawed as the original stories are, did do something new and is worthy and did advance epic fantasy in a very, very real way. And I think it is rough. It is not high literature. It doesn't have to be. It's still got good shit in it, right?
Yeah. It's one of those things where he actually did a really good job of making his points in the story without feeling like he's shoving it down your throat.
Yeah.
We'll get to that when we talk more about House of the Dragon.
Yeah. And I think that, well, part of that was because, he was writing the books just as Poland was getting its own real government. Right. It was 91 he started writing, 93 I think. I
didn't know it was 91 he started. That's the year I was born.
Oh, there you go. But that was just when the Soviet Union was falling apart, and finally people could talk about the shit the Russians did. They could be Nazis bad, but you could not talk against the Russians. It was not allowed. And so I do think The Witcher is not intentionally, Sapkowski has
I think it's the same way Tolkien says
Yeah,
he
it's not
hates
allegory,
allegory,
but
and
it's
yet we
total.
still see how his life experience affects his writing.
I think it's more well, Tolkien has the problem of I hate allegory, but the dwarves are totally the Jews. Like, which is it, dude? Which is it? You cannot have this both ways, right? But I'm obviously stretching that a little bit. But I think it's more he was just writing with The Witcher, he was just writing what he knew. And he was writing from the heart, and it was a
Mhm.
grizzled, withered, grumpy old heart, but it was from the heart, and that's pretty cool.
That is a very accurate
Yeah, yeah,
description of Sapkowski.
yeah.
It's just
That's
like when they just announced recasting Geralt, and I'm like,
you
you
can't.
Sapkowski, who hates adaptation
Yeah,
and hates any other take on his work,
yeah, yeah.
and he loved Cavill, and you're letting him get away.
But let's face it, Netflix is just doing it to go one more season. They're
Yeah,
trying to lose less money. Obviously, they did not have the strongest of contracts. Netflix makes mistakes a lot. It's going to be the last season of The Witcher. Like I dropped off that show, I'll admit,
yeah,
because and this is one of the things I was about the whole bad boy thing, right? um the Witcher series fails to understand where the nobility of these really, really coarse people comes from, which is the fact that you meet them as they are, and you find out the horrible shit that happened to them retroactively. There'll be little things here and there, right? Like they'll drop a
exactly.
brief story. You don't see them. The work doesn't roll around in it.
Yeah, and you especially see that with Yennefer, where it's like, oh, let's
Yeah.
just tell her story up front. No, you meet Yennefer.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I have to use this word. She's a bitch.
Oh, Jennifer is deliberately. And
Yes,
and I love Yennefer. I love Yennefer so much. And the Netflix show ruined her.
and you see her behavior, you see how she acts, you see
Yeah.
how she treats Geralt. I Here's the Witcher is so weird because it's everything I usually hate,
Yep.
but it's
But
done
it's
so well.
authentic. It's
And
authentic.
yes, and I remember reading A Shard of Ice,
Yeah.
which is the story. It's one of the short stories where they just got back together and they're traveling together,
Yeah.
and they're staying in an inn. She's working
Again. Yeah.
with another sorcerer,
Again. Yeah.
and she tells him the story of the Ice Queen. And Sapkowski has this thing where he incorporates fairy tales,
Yeah.
but in like a twisted way.
Yeah.
And so basically, she tells him the story of the Ice Queen, who comes through, and if you're hit by a shard of her ice, it freezes your
Your
heart.
heart.
Basically, it's the story that inspired Frozen.
Yeah. Yeah.
And throughout the story, you realize that the whole point is that Yennefer has that shard of ice.
Yeah.
And this is when I really started to realize Geralt was a bit of a dork.
Yeah.
Because he's like, look, if you're the Ice Queen, lash me to your sleigh.
Yeah.
Drag me along. It's a confession of love, and I'm all for it. But at the same time, then we find out she's cheating on him.
Because she's not going, she can't trust.
Yeah, but also at the end of the story, she's the one who realizes she's hurting two different people.
Yeah.
And so she leaves, and it absolutely wrecks Geralt.
Yeah.
But it was the only thing she could have done. And then as the story goes on, and Ciri is such a big part of her healing.
Yeah.
And finally having someone who loves her.
But
not
it's also
just
a safe love, right? It's a different love than No, Ciri's really important. Yeah.
Yeah, because this is a woman whose body has been used against her.
That's
and her
right.
sexuality that she was forced to use cheaply,
right,
just to try and gain power, do
right.
this and that. And so we see where all that trauma comes from. And at the same time, that desperation to be loved because her own parents couldn't. And that's why she wanted a child.
Yeah.
Was because Geralt, as much as he loves her, there is still the sexual aspect to that. And she can't move past the trauma she has. And so having Ciri, the daughter, the child she
Mhm.
loves and who loves her, that heals her greatly, but she's still traumatized and she's still bitter enough that she can tell a goddess to fuck off
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
say, you will not stop me from saving my daughter.
Yep. Yep.
And
And that's why I think Yennefer's a great character. I don't think she's great for Geralt, but deliberately,
yeah,
right?
and Sapkowski, like you said, he did a great job of, you see how they are and
Yeah.
who they are, and then you learn the trauma that made them who they are.
Yeah, but it
And that's
doesn't
such good writing.
roll around in it.
Yeah, and but that doesn't work if you just unload the trauma
Yeah.
up front.
The
And it's
feminist
like,
body horror on premium cable and streaming, I am so done with it. Can we not? You know, I am so that somebody had to work through a lot of freaking trauma. It's not the violence that really stays with you. It is the stuff that goes on in your head. It is the self-recriminations. It is that lingering emotional stuff. It's not I don't even want to describe that sick shit they did in the first episode, the first season of The Witcher. Like, what the, none of that was canon. What the
no,
fuck was that? That was just cheap torture porn. I don't know
it's
why you
shock
have to
value.
it's more than that though. It's, you have to see a woman's pain for it to be treated as real. You have to see the very bad thing instead of just taking her word for it and letting the performance give you what happened to her. And you'd never show something that graphic with a male character. It would have to be hints, right? Because that is considered too awful to be done to a man and him still be strong.
So here's the thing. Yeah. I don't 100% agree with that, because
which part?
So we not showing a man's torture and pain like that.
Oh no, I mean anything of a sexual nature.
Well, here's the thing. So even Outlander, and I haven't watched Outlander, so I don't know how graphic it is, but there is a scene where the male character is raped.
Oh, it wasn't as graphic as that.
Okay.
Yeah,
And
no,
but
no,
I know,
no.
yeah, it turns out the male lead actor was actually the one who demanded they start bringing in intimacy coordinators.
Yeah.
Because he was really upset that they forced him to do a full frontal nude scene in that.
Yeah. I mean, that's about as graphic as it gets.
Yeah. And so they're one of the big.
And let me pause. The fact that he had to tell them we should do this is just inexcusable.
Yeah.
Right? Like the fact that they didn't think.
How long have intimacy coordinators been a thing in Hollywood?
It been a thing or normalized?
Normalized.
It's been since Me Too.
Okay. And so how long have they been a thing before that?
Well, obviously they existed because they sure came in fast when they needed them, right? It was just seen. That's a weird thing in Hollywood, and it's creepy and disturbing, and you get people like Sean Bean saying, "Oh, they ruined the spontaneity." It's like, all right, dude, that's your call, but for people who have never done something like this before and maybe aren't cool with it, it's an amount of structure that makes you feel less violated, because it's not, it's that kind of shit is so freaking artificial to shoot. It is uncomfortable to the point of painful to get all those pretty angles, right?
Yeah.
Those are tiring scenes to shoot. They are hard on the body, and if a semi inflated volleyball is going to make things a little more comfortable for people, so you're not, a lot of it is for the men who may have some involuntary body responses that they can't control. And it's just shielding them from the embarrassment of that. And they don't talk about that. They tend to talk about it from the women's point of view.
Yeah.
But when there is contact, when there is stimulation, sometimes that happens. And it's not that it just, the body does, sometimes it unnerves, right?
Yeah.
And I do think that it's really good, especially with, oh my God, there's so much now. Like, so much that is unnecessary and doesn't even really work all that well. It doesn't serve the meaning. But yeah,
Well, I just asked because like I believe Outlander started in like 2014,
yeah,
2015, so that would have been pre Me Too.
yeah, it would have been before that. But
Yeah.
yeah, it just that this is a thing that is a tough one, right? And one of the things about the bad boy in the 50s and so on is the hint of abuse, like child abuse in those characters, right? There's always the thing where he left home early, or it, to me it's implied at a time that that was not spoken about because it was pre second wave feminism, right? It was considered a private matter. And so there is a very strong edge of a young man who was abused as a kid. And I do find that the men they cast as bad boys, and James Bond waffles on this one because there's a lot of writing about James Bond being a bad boy as the lead instead of the love interest. I'm not sure how I feel about that one. We can maybe talk about that a bit more in part 2. But the bad boy is a more feminized, masculine look facially than
it's like I said, they tend to be more emotional and more in touch with their feelings.
And they look more slightly less chiseled. And people, what are you talking about, James Dean? No, if you look at James Dean compared to the other actors of his day,
he's a pretty boy.
He's a pretty boy.
Not in the way we view that phrase now.
Yeah.
But at the time.
Yeah.
That kind of baby face.
Yeah. He would have been the sugar face as opposed to the sauce face when we go into, Asian actors. That I always saw that undercurrent, and maybe that's just because of how, delving into gay cinema and stuff like that, you get the coding. But there is definitely that. Why doesn't society work for him? Well, something pretty bad happened to him. What? Society doesn't care, right? And I do think that Geralt's to me, traditionally, even in the 90s, and this is what I think is broken now, and I want to talk about why it's broken now in the second half next week, because we're coming up in an hour and we're gonna get that fucking noise, and I want to stop before the noise this week. But the whole point of the bad boy for me is that at the beginning of the work, you think he is broken and bad, and yes, he's transgressive. But the bad boy is supposed to show how society is broken and bad and transgressive. Subtly. Because you couldn't scare the straights too much back then, right? You had to question norms, not outright rage against them. And, in the 30s and the 40s, we're talking about intense censorship periods, right? So you couldn't have the bad boy get away with it.
The
crime does not pay. Yeah, exactly. That whole crime does not pay stump speech. But everybody wanted the escape from the rigid rules, right? And I do think that was a very meaningful part of the entire bad boy thing up until the premium cable era and Joss Whedon. And I do lay a lot of this at him. And even, I'm going to go there, even Zuko being the most interesting character in Avatar The Last Airbender. Right?
Zuko is like prime, I want to say he's prime bad boy material.
Yeah.
But he's really not.
No, he's a more Asian media. Well, it's not Asian, but it's appropriated Asian structure. It wants to be, but Asian media has far more demarcations, like subtropes of a trope. And I do think that Western media borrowing that without understanding the whole self within a collective family honor riff that media is playing with. It gets results that are messy.
Yeah. There's the meme about the precious cinnamon roll.
Yeah.
Too good, too sweet for this world. And it's like, it's the character. They're just sweet. They're sunshine.
Yep.
But then I don't know if this was just a Tumblr thing, but then they carried it on. So it's like, then there's the cinnamon roll that's been overcooked.
Yeah.
Or he's just stale. He's been in the world too long.
Yeah.
It's worn him down. That's Zuko.
Yeah.
Is the slightly stale, slightly burnt cinnamon roll.
But I mean, Zuko's definitely the most interesting character in Avatar.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And I do think that and the shit Whedon did on Buffy and the shit he did in the Avengers and all that stuff just really ruined the cultural, because you get bad men like Joss Whedon, like Harvey Weinstein, like Kevin Spacey. I mean, Frank Underwood always bothered me on House of Cards because he had power, right? Oh, he's so bad. He's so interesting. We love him. It's guilty pleasure. No, it's not. He's a terrible person. And he just murdered a girl and got away. Not, how do I put this? It didn't feel fair. It just felt, well, they had to chuck him because he got caught.
So here's a question that's been going in my mind as you've been talking about this. How would you compare a character like Frank Underwood with Tony Soprano? Because I haven't seen House of Cards, but I've seen The Sopranos.
That's a tough one because you're talking about, that's the mob, right? That's sort of the Scorsese tradition. It's funny, I just had this conversation with somebody. The Scorsese tradition dealing with the mob is that eventually those characters are not gonna get a happily ever after.
Yeah.
And the whole organized crime thing, that's a really complicated thing that I could talk about for like 20 minutes. But because Tony Soprano is branded as a criminal right off the top, I did find The Sopranos really uncomfortable at times. It's not my favorite show, but he's a criminal. We established that off the top. Frank Underwood being a politician, I don't think politicians have to be inherently corrupt, and this belief that they all are, I think, is actually damaging civic participation and our ability to get things done. When you brand somebody as a criminal off the top and then go, but we're going to humanize him, that's a totally different exercise of, here's this piece of shit with power, and we're going to watch him roll around in it, abuse everyone in his life, and get away with it for 4 seasons before the actor gets caught. That show should have been Robin Wright's character, his wife, dealing with that sack of shit. But that never would have gotten made at the time, right? So now we are getting that sound.
Yeah.
So we're going to pause. Next week, we're going to talk more about that whole, I think, ruining of the whole thing with the world building and bad boys versus bad guys and how the world surrounding them impacts that. So, okay.
And I think this is where we'll get into House of the Dragon.
Yes, that's where we'll get into House of the Dragon. That's where, definitely, because that's just such a glaring example of the problem that started with Buffy. It didn't start with Buffy, but that was the first time I was aware where I was going, this ain't good. Like, this really isn't good. Like, what is happening? And I was alone at the time. So, yeah, that'll be next week. Thanks for listening to Two Women Talking. You can find Song's channel in the description box of this video. See you next week.